The Israeli response is essentially to conduct a genocide in Gaza. They are attempting to expel or murder all the Palestinians there. This is a crime against humanity under international law, but Israel justifies it with a cover story, which is that it is going after Hamas.
Today I have the pleasure to introduce you to a true living legend in the world of diplomacy and a visionary whose remarkable achievements have not only shaped the course of his country. Ambassador Chas Freeman is a retired career diplomat, and he has not just walked the corridors of power, he has left footprints on the global stage that not many can rival. I think it's fair to say that Ambassador Freeman's journey is a remarkable lineup of accomplishments. From his role as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs during the pivotal period in the post-Cold War era, to receiving the highest public service awards for his role in reshaping the European security landscape and revitalizing the defense relations with China, he's a true heavyweight of diplomacy. But that's just the beginning. Someone has called Ambassador Freeman's career a masterclass in international relations. For example, he served as the US ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the critical period of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. For some, that alone would qualify as a lifetime achievement. But Ambassador Freeman's legacy extends far beyond the Middle East. He played a crucial role as Principal Assistant Secretary of State during the historic mediation of Namibian independence from South Africa and the Cuban troop withdrawal from Angola. And as if all of that's not enough, as Director for the Chinese Affairs at the US State Department, he played an important role during the historic visit of President Nixon to China in 1972. This was a moment that reshaped world geopolitics that has been felt for decades. But in today's interview, we are focusing on Israel, Gaza, the Hamas attacks, and what Israel's response means for Israel, America, and the world. Ambassador Freeman is here to share his wisdom and vision that only a lifetime of diplomatic service can provide. So get ready for an interview that will challenge your beliefs, especially if you get your news mostly from mainstream media. Although on second thought, if you watch this channel, then you probably are already aware of the all-pervasive propaganda of the global war machine. Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for joining. Today is Boxing Day. I really appreciate you take the time today away from your family around Christmas with me. Thank you so much.
Well, I look forward to our conversation.
Likewise. Thank you again. I had a look at your more than impressive career, right? And I picked a couple of things out. You were Assistant Secretary of Defense. You were Assistant Secretary of State. You were the US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Desert Shield and Desert Storm operations, right? You played a central role in developing the new European security architecture under NATO, which unfortunately I have to say is collapsing at the moment.
Exactly.
Right? You were working for Nixon to open up China, and also that point is on very shaky grounds at the moment, right? You were involved in the end of the apartheid in South Africa, which makes you especially interesting for our discussion about Israel today. So it's fair to say, I mean, absolutely, and there is no politeness on my part, you're a diplomatic heavyweight. Did I miss any key points? I mean, the list is long, yeah, but did I miss any key points in regards to your career?
No, I think that was a very nice summary of high points. I had a spectacularly successful career. I was often in the right place at the right time, sometimes by plan, sometimes by accident.
That's how life sometimes goes. Yeah, you can plan one thing and life throws you a curveball and you find yourself in a completely different direction.
Exactly.
Yeah. I have to give Professor Glenn Deason, whom I interviewed recently, credit in pointing me in your direction. I know that you spoke to him too, and he pointed out that, you know, you have also a certain modesty on one hand, and on the other hand, you're quite outspoken when it comes to, how shall I say this, the new global order, America and Israel. So I would like to start our little conversation, not by, well, actually it is a question, but a free and open question, yeah? In your own words, and right away jumping into Israel, Gaza, yeah? In your own words, what do you think is happening? What's your own analysis in regards to what's happening in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, Lebanon, in the Middle East at this very moment?
Well, I think we have to go back before October 7th, when Hamas military arm organized a spectacular jailbreak, and rather like slave revolts in our own history in the United States, carried out grievous atrocities against any Israeli they encountered. Their objective was military. When they broke out of the Gaza concentration camp, which is the largest in the world, other groups and individuals came with them, followed them. So Hamas may have committed atrocities on its own, but I suspect the bulk of the atrocities were committed by other Gazans, people who sought revenge for the abuses that they have suffered for so very long. Be that as it may, the Israeli response is essentially to conduct a genocide in Gaza. They are attempting to expel or murder all the Palestinians there, either murder them with bombing or murder them by starvation. This is a crime against humanity under international law, but Israel justifies it with a cover story, which is that it is going after Hamas. Hamas, which was extremely unpopular in Gaza, is now very popular in the West Bank, where atrocities are being conducted by Israeli settlers. The sad thing about all this is, from an American point of view, that the United States is completely complicit in all of these war crimes. Without us, Israel would not be able to conduct this war. We supply the ammunition and we supply the political protection from the international community's growing outrage. We could end the war if we wanted to, but apparently we don't. So our own reputation is following Israel's in a tailspin into depths that never could have been imagined. Much of our history is one in which the global community admired the United States. We don't enjoy that admiration anymore. And I think, therefore, this war is going to have huge future impact on not just on Israel, which will be an international pariah, but on the United States, which will not enjoy the esteem and the prestige that we have been accustomed to since World War II.
Yeah, you used a strong wording, right? It was a jailbreak. I heard you speaking of Gaza as a concentration camp, genocide, right? With your contacts in the diplomatic corps, in the US diplomatic corps, how is the vision there? I mean, is it an isolated point of view or is this a wider spread sentiment?
Well, I am not in close touch with the current generation of American diplomats. I am retired and I speak only for myself. But I believe that there is a great deal of anxiety on the part of my former colleagues currently serving in the diplomatic service with both the moral and global power implications of what we are doing. From a moral point of view, our position is essentially indefensible. From the point of view of the impact on our interests, it is devastating. So I doubt very much that anyone other than true believers or people who are committed to Zionism will find it easy to sympathize with what we're doing.
I am a European. Obviously, I'm living here in the relatively safety of Netherlands, and then I'm looking with, how shall I say, puzzlement or amazement on certain voices in America. And one example that I'm having is presidential hopeful Nikki Haley with her infamous video, "Finish them, finish them." And if you think that couldn't be topped, there is a recent video of her where she actually blames Putin for the Hamas attacks on October 7th, because it must have been Putin because that's his birthday.
Well, one of the problems with democracies is that we tend to demonize our enemies. We do that for the purpose of mobilizing support for policies that might otherwise not enjoy support. And that is certainly the case here. We have a further complication in the United States in that we are very dependent on campaign donations. The candidates require those, and a disproportionate percentage of campaign donations originate with Jewish plutocrats, very wealthy people who are committed to the state of Israel. That is emphatically the case in the Democratic Party, where about 50% of donations come from such people. It is less so in the Republican Party, but the influence of campaign donations, a requirement for campaigning, is very, very great. And so candidates pander to that opinion. I don't know. Nikki Haley is, of course, of Indian origin, and she may very well share some of the Islamophobia that has gripped India as well as your own country, I might say.
I know. So you're referring to Geert Wilders, who in the recent election won 35 or 37 seats from 150. So it was quite a shock effect through...
Exactly. I mean, I think the Netherlands has a global reputation for having a strong sense of conscience. And to see Mr. Wilders emerge as a leading figure in the Netherlands is quite a shock. But then in the United States, we had a candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy, outdo Nikki Haley when he proposed to stick the heads of 100 Hamas people on poles and put them around Gaza. This is a level of barbarism, again, coming from an Indian American. One wonders why that is so. But it is a level of barbarism that we really have not seen before.
Yeah. Before we go back into actual Gaza and Israel, a couple of things about America. So in my notes I have here. So Biden is the largest recipient in the Congress of Jewish donations, right? He has proclaimed himself a Zionist. And I think it was your words, yeah. You said he's firm in supporting genocide, yeah. Same true for the current Secretary of State, who is a Zionist.
Yes.
Right? And then, of course, we have the statement from Netanyahu, where it's a couple of years old now, yeah. Where he basically explains how easy it is to manipulate America. Can you comment on this?
Well, Mr. Biden is historically the largest single recipient of Zionist Israel lobby contributions. There are others who rival him, but he is the greatest beneficiary of these donations. And I think he's very sincere in his commitment to Zionism, as is Mr. Blinken. Mr. Blinken made a point when he arrived in Israel shortly after October 7th of reminding people that he was the descendant of Holocaust victims and himself a Zionist. So I think there's a sincere commitment. And on the other hand, I can't believe that either of these gentlemen or those who agree with them are blind to what is happening on the ground in Gaza. And I note that Mr. Biden has steadily given ground. He's been opposed to a ceasefire at all. Then he agreed to a humanitarian ceasefire, which I think, frankly, was a farce. It was a little bit like offering someone at Auschwitz a drink of cold water while they wait to go to the gas chamber. It had no serious effect on the course of the program that Israel was conducting. And now we see yesterday, Christmas Day, Mr. Netanyahu in Gaza with his troops, exhorting them to continue this fight to the end. What is the end? The end is a Palestinian-free Gaza. The same time he was doing that, there is at least one Israeli real estate construction company offering property on the beach in Gaza once Gaza has been totally destroyed and can be rebuilt with settlements from Israel. And finally, on Christmas Day, the Israeli occupation forces attacked Bethlehem, which shows a certain indifference to widespread international opinion, at least. So I think what's going on is inexcusable. And as I said, it will have huge long-term effects.
And it's a little bit reminiscent on how is the fable of the emperor without clothes, right? So there's a new congressional resolution that equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and it was adopted by 311 to 14, 15, something
14.
like this. It's like 14. It's like making it law that an apple and a pear is the same thing, but it doesn't make it so.
Quite right. And, I think we have a new phenomenon, which is members of Congress who seem to vie to create a new organization called Jews for Genocide. Now, if criticizing Jews for advocating genocide is somehow anti-Semitic, then we have a real problem. It is horrible that the descendants of people who were subjected by Europeans to genocide should themselves now be carrying out a Holocaust against Palestinians. And there are many deep roots for this, of course. One can understand the emotional reaction, the desire for revenge on the part of Israelis, as one must also understand it on the part of the Palestinians. But what is happening is certainly the worst atrocity of this century.
If you compare it, I think I heard you comparing it to what the Nazis did in Europe. Do you still remember what you said?
Yes, I do. The Nazis at least had enough of a sense of shame and guilt that they tried to conceal what they were doing. The Israelis are completely open about it. Mr. Netanyahu cites the biblical extermination of the Amalek, the rules of engagement that have been given to Israeli soldiers, as demonstrated in their murder of 3 Israeli hostages who escaped from their captivity, is basically to shoot everything that moves. The Israeli army has spent most of its recent decades policing the West Bank and surrounding Gaza as in order to protect settlers. It has not trained for the kind of warfare it is now engaged in, and it is taking pretty heavy casualties. How heavy, we don't know, because the Israeli Defense Force spokesman try to cover this up. But there is information coming out which suggests that perhaps as many as 5,000 Israeli troops have been suffered wounds or died. Most of them probably wounded rather than dead. But this is a serious. This began as a simple slaughter of civilians from the air. It is now a ground battle between what appear to be very well-trained Hamas warriors and a very poorly trained Israeli Defense Force. One of the things that is coming out of this disaster, debacle, if you will, is the discrediting of the Israeli Armed Forces' reputation for efficiency. They are certainly redoubling their reputation for ruthlessness, but they are not showing the military skills that they have professed to have in this battle, and that too will have its long-term effects. Meanwhile, the immediate effects of this are very considerable internationally. There's just been a poll that shows that 96% of Saudis believe that all Arab countries with diplomatic relations with Israel should now break them. I'm sure that sentiment is widely shared outside Saudi Arabia. So the so-called Abraham Accords, which attempted to set aside the issue of Palestine and Palestinian self-determination and basically provide an economic basis for normalization between Arab countries and Israel, are now not just suspended, but in serious jeopardy. And this includes, by the way, the relationship with Egypt under the Camp David Accords and the relationship with Jordan under the extension of those. Egypt is now massing troops on the Gaza border because it cannot accept the Israeli program of expelling Palestinians into Sinai for several reasons. First, Egypt has its own problems with Sinai, which has been a very lawless area. It has been attempting to suppress the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Hamas is a branch. It could not accept 2 million Palestinians in a lawless area who would sympathize with and support the opponents of General Sisi and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is the president for life in Egypt. So even the Camp David Accords are in danger. More widely, the Security Council has been paralyzed, as usual, by an American veto on this subject. The recent passage with an American abstention of an essentially nugatory, meaningless resolution does not change the reputational damage to the United States and to the UN. There are more and more people calling for a replacement for the UN, either by some sort of ad hoc process, perhaps ad hoc conferences or whatever, or by a full reform of the sort that replaced the League of Nations with the UN. So the UN's reputation, its utility, if you will, in foreign affairs, is being badly degraded. In the midst of this, we have an outrageous Israeli set of attacks on the Secretary General for calling attention to the humanitarian crisis that Israel is causing. And we have now Israel refusing to offer visas to UN officials in retaliation for what they see as UN hostility. One has to wonder about the worldview of the Zionist establishment in Israel, if they are so much out of touch with both morality and international opinion that they think these actions, either in Gaza or against the UN, will have any resonance whatsoever abroad. I would say finally that there is fallout from this on the issue of Ukraine, where much of the world, the global majority, if you will, has opted to sit the war out and has not been sympathetic to the NATO G7 position on Ukraine. This just adds to the sense that Europeans, NATO, Americans have a double standard. We care a great deal about white refugees from Ukraine, and we care not at all about brown and black refugees from the Middle East or from Africa. And we don't even care when genocide is conducted against Muslims. So this is Mr. Wilder's program, I suppose, but now recognized as such and drawing grave antipathy with the global majority. And this too will have its long-term effects. In effect, it is discrediting all of the claims of Western civilization to aspire to a higher standard of human rights, human dignity, and safety. And it is undoing all of the laws that were passed internationally after World War II in response to the Nazi and Japanese rampages through Europe and Asia. And the Geneva Conventions have been essentially suspended. And the International Criminal Court, which has now received cases against Israel from both Algeria and South Africa, will have to take those up in a context where its credibility will be entirely at stake.
Yeah, I think you brought Ukraine in the mix. I think that the problem, that the proxy war between America and Russia would have already been enough problems for the US hegemony. Yeah, but now with this additional conflict between, I mean, it's not even a conflict. You call it genocide, right?
It's a slaughter.
slaughter, yeah, it's even further undermined. And you mentioned the example of the UN, but there's another example. Of course, BRICS is growing, right? Saudi Arabia will join BRICS now in January, right?
Sure.
So what's your point of view about the potential of BRICS as a, let's say, look, I consider the petrodollar the lifeblood of America. You can correct me if I'm wrong, yeah? Without the petrodollar, and unfortunately most people don't understand what it actually is, yeah? Without the petrodollar, no American super carriers, carrying airplane warplanes around the world, yeah? So with BRICS growing, how dangerous is BRICS to the petrodollar?
BRICS has basically been of course, it began as an economic grouping for stock market investment purposes. It was invented by somebody, I think, at Goldman Sachs as a grouping of emerging markets. It has become something beyond that, a sort of protest movement against the G7, and more particularly against what Mr. Blinken calls the rules-based order, by which he means an order dictated by the G7, the US, which makes the rules and determines who is subject to them and who is not. This is a very different concept from the law-based order of the post-World War II period, with the UN Charter at its head and international law established by consensus and applicable to all countries as its principle. So we have departed from that order quite determinedly. BRICS expansion is a reflection of widening dismay and discontent with European and American unilateralism, primarily American. And one of the main instruments of this is dollar sovereignty. That is to say, under international law, since the dollar is the U.S. currency, the U.S. can claim jurisdiction over transactions in dollars. But the dollar is also the global currency. And to treat it as a national currency is to abuse its function as a trade settlement mechanism. And you're absolutely correct. The status of the dollar depends entirely on an agreement that was struck in 1974 after the Arab oil embargo against various countries, your own included. This was done by Kissinger and Simon, the then Secretary of the Treasury, with Saudi Arabia. And the agreement was that the flood of dollars that Saudi Arabia and other members of OPEC were earning from their repriced sales of energy in the West would be denominated in dollars, would be reinvested in the United States in treasuries and other instruments, financial instruments. And therefore, this is the basis for the pricing of all commodities except one. I believe cocoa is still priced in sterling. This is the basis for the pricing of all commodities in dollars. And the fact that the dollar can be transformed into real things is what gives these little green portraits of dead presidents the value that they have. So it is all connected, and you're absolutely correct. The loss of dollar hegemony would cost the United States its global hegemony. What would be the effects? We are flirting with this because interfering with institutions like SWIFT, the system in Brussels for communicating about dollar-based transactions, euro-based transactions as well, interfering with that on a unilateral basis is an invasion of the sovereignty and in policy independence of every other country in the world. And they all object to this. And so there have been increasing efforts, BRICS notwithstanding, BRICS is part of it, many of them led by Russia, but also of interest to China and even to India, although India is at odds with much of BRICS on other issues. There has been an increasing effort to find alternatives to the dollar. An explosion in bilateral currency swap arrangements, the exploration of a possible syncretic synthetic currency, digital currency, for trade settlement, the development of national digital currencies for that purpose, the expansion of the use of non-dollar global currencies, including the Chinese yuan or renminbi, but also the euro to some extent, the Japanese yen, the British pound, of course, as alternatives. And the dollar, therefore, is not in an assured survival position as the global trade settlement mechanism. I'll make one last obvious point, and that is that dollar reserves are different from trade settlement in dollars. It is the fact that you can settle trade in dollars conveniently that makes the dollar a worthwhile reserve currency. The purpose of reserves is to hold value. The purpose of transaction settlement is to complete a transaction. So one is very short-term, the other is long-term. But the long-term value of the dollar depends on its status as a mechanism for trade settlement. And that is what is being attacked by currency swaps and other innovative mechanisms in the financial world. So all of this is very connected, and to the extent that the United States continues to rely on the promiscuous application of sanctions, we run the risk of undoing our own global supremacy.
We will talk about the sanctions when we talk about Russia next time. For the time being, I would like to come back to Gaza and citing some reports that come actually from Israel and specifically from the newspaper Haaretz. Yeah? So the pictures that came around the world from those festival goers fleeing and being murdered were quite primal or almost. They go directly into the subconscious. Yeah? But then it turns out that at least some of those festival goers were killed by the Israeli army. So there's a video from a helicopter shooting on fleeing cars. Then they have the tanks that attacked the kibbutz houses, right, where they blew the houses knowing that there are terrorists plus the inhabitants in there, right? Then I have seen videos where you virtually have hundreds and hundreds of destroyed cars next to each other on this parking lot that can't be Hamas with their whatever RGBs or what they're having. They were not only burnt, they were like blown to pieces, right? So are those credible reports stating that actually for quite some degree the Israeli army might be responsible for the dead Israelis on October 7?
Yes, and there are two reasons for this. One is the Israelis lacked discipline and the training necessary to respond effectively to the hostage taking that Hamas carried out, which, by the way, was aimed primarily by Hamas at taking Israeli soldiers. The kibbutzim are garrisoned with soldiers. They are military settlements. Many of the people, the men there, some of the women, are in the Israeli reserves, and Hamas sought to take them as hostages. Undisciplined fire by helicopters with Hellfire missiles or by tanks with incendiary rounds directed at buildings is what happened. And this is a disgrace in military terms, and it adds to the diminution of the reputation the Israeli Defense Forces have had for military discipline and expertise. But the second reason is something called the Hannibal Directive. Yeah, so, and that is, given the fact that Israel has an enormous number of Palestinian hostages, people it has put in its prisons, often with no charges, sometimes with fake charges, sometimes with a genuine judicial process conducted by military courts. But it has a huge number of hostages, and many times in the past, Israeli hostages have been exchanged for Palestinian hostages in a vastly disproportionate ratio. So the Hannibal Directive basically says that rather than get into bargaining over a hostage exchange, you should just kill the Israeli hostages along with their captors. And that was also a factor here. But there's no question the participants in this outlandish music festival, just think for a moment, they're having a music festival on the border of a concentration camp. And the people in the concentration camp can hear and see what's going on. This is outlandish, to say the least. But to the people who were killed there were largely killed, it appears, by Hellfire missiles and by other undisciplined fire by Israeli forces who reacted in a chaotic manner to what had happened. And this brings me to a fundamental point. The Hamas had two objectives. One was to put the Palestinian self-determination issue back on the global agenda, and they have succeeded. There is widespread recognition, at least outside Israel, that only self-determination for Palestine in the form of a two-state solution can provide security to Israel and end the instability in the Holy Land. Many Israelis would disagree with what I've just said, but the fact is that their view is not accepted outside Israel for the most part. And even in my own country, which has a larger Jewish population than Israel, many Jews have come to realize that this is the case. Younger Jews, in particular, in the United States, I don't know about the Netherlands, but in the United States are very disillusioned with Zionism and don't want to be suffer contagion from it in the form of anti-Semitism, which is actually growing now as a result of Israeli actions. So I think one effect is Hamas's success in putting this issue back on the global agenda, in destroying the Abraham Accords approach of setting aside this issue of Palestinian self-determination. But it has also given Hamas enormous popularity among Palestinians because they are seen as having stood up, as having been willing to accept death rather than captivity. And this is where I'm grateful to Norman Finkelstein who, for bringing up the analogy of slave revolts in the United States. The 1831 revolt by Nat Turner, a well-educated, very intelligent, enslaved African, who led a slave revolt in Southern Virginia, and which had as its objective the murder of every white person they encountered. And they murdered some 60 white people, the majority also women and children, as in Gaza. This raises a moral question. Is the violence of the slave owner the same morally as the violence of a slave trying to end that violence? And the same moral issue arises with Israeli oppression of Palestinians versus Palestinian resistance to oppression. But as was the case in the Nat Turner revolt, the retaliation by American whites against American blacks was gravely disproportionate. At least 120 African Americans were lynched. Others were shot. There were mock trials, which were very unjust. And this is not remembered fondly by anybody in my country at present. And I don't think what Israel is doing in Gaza will be remembered fondly by anyone in future. When people think of Israel in the past, they thought of it as a refuge for the victims of the Holocaust, victims of Central European, I'm sorry to say not exclusively German, anti-Semitism. And now they will think of it as the home of perpetrators of genocide. And when they think of Israel, they will think of burnt buildings and dead babies. So this is an image problem of a fundamental nature. And from the point of view of Israel, it strips Israel of its protection by charges of anti-Semitism against anyone who is critical of Israel, because to be critical of people who are carrying out genocide cannot be anti-Semitism. It cannot be considered immoral. Anti-Semitism is a despicable attitude, but to oppose genocide by Israel is not.
I saw an interview from Netanyahu, it is a couple of years old, where he expressed hope to find a justification to clear out, I believe, not only Gaza, but also the West Bank. So is October the 7th that incident that Netanyahu was hoping for?
I suppose it is. I think his exact statement was he hoped for a war which would provide an excuse for the final removal of all Palestinians from the land of Israel as claimed by Israel. Israel, of course, is a unique country in that it has no borders. The borders
and no constitution.
It constantly expands. And it is also unique in that the Likud party constitution or charter calls for Israel to extend from the river to the sea. This phrase, which is now mistaken as some sort of Palestinian, charged as some sort of Palestinian endorsement of genocide, was in fact quite the opposite. It is a Zionist endorsement of genocide against Palestinians. Now, I think for a long time, I felt that saving Israel from itself would require a one-state solution. That is to say, a single democracy in which people of whatever ethnic or religious background were all treated equally. That is an ideal of the European Enlightenment my own country has tried to exemplify, not very successfully, I should say, but we have aspired to that. But I think, the reason I felt that way was I'm very familiar with apartheid. Apartheid was a theory of separate development based on neo-Nazi anthropological theories by Mr. Forster after World War II, the Afrikaner leader, who created who was a thug but a prominent figure in the National Party in South Africa. And the theory was that each ethnic group in South Africa, whether they were Afrikaners or Anglos, or they were Zulus or Xhosa or Swazis or whoever they were, Tswana, should have the right to develop their own culture and economy as they wished, separately. That was the theory. The reality was, of course, racial oppression and white supremacy. But it was very different from segregation in the United States. And if you went to Johannesburg in that time, as I did frequently, you would see white waiters waiting on black couples at restaurants, something that was unthinkable in the American South. So that was a very different phenomenon. There's nothing good about it. And we're all much better off now that it has been overthrown. But the Israeli version of this is vastly more complicated and cruel, because Israel rules over 4 categories of people: Jewish citizens, who are full citizens; Arab Israelis, who are second-class citizens and denied many of the rights, responsibilities, and benefits that are available to Jewish citizens, full citizens; people in the West Bank, who are under martial law and a Kafkaesque system of pass and and
Cages.
checkpoint controls, which is designed to be so frustrating as to cause people to immigrate. And finally, the population of Gaza, who have been treated as though they were in a prisoner concentration camp, periodically bombed and strafed, and who are now subject to a campaign of annihilation by Israel. These are four categories. This system is totally unsustainable if there is any ounce of legal or moral authority left in the world. I think this war, rather than empowering that system, as Mr. Netanyahu hopes, or consolidating it, is going to prove its destruction.
On this note, Mr. Ambassador, I have one last question for today. With your extensive knowledge, and I do know you don't have a crystal ball, yeah? With your extensive knowledge, where do you see this specifically now in regards to, let's say, the Israel-Palestine conflict? Where do you see this going to?
I think there has to be a halt to American aid to Israel in order to stop this, because Americans of conscience cannot support the funding, the weapons supply, and the political protection internationally that we are providing to those who are guilty of genocide and who are open about that guilt and their intentions. So I think this is going to prove in the short term an intolerable strain on the Biden administration. And I think they will give way eventually. I think that Israel has limited time to continue what it is doing. But more important than the short-term effects, which among other things seem very likely to discredit Mr. Biden with the electorate to the extent that Mr. Trump will be the next president. That has huge implications of a global nature, which we can get into on another occasion. But I think the long-term effects in terms of the estrangement of the world from Israel and of the United States from Israel. The United States now virtually the only shameless backer of Israel, are going to be profound. So Mr. Netanyahu may think he's getting what he wanted, but I think he's going to be very sorry with what he gets.
Be careful what you wish for, because your wish might come through.
Exactly.
Mr. Ambassador, it was my absolute privilege talking to you. Thank you for your time today. And I wish you all the best for the remainder of this Christmas weekend.
Thank you. And next time, please pick a happier topic.
I will. Thank you.
Okay.